Good evening, everyone. How are you? I hope everyone's well. I am Jordan Cooper. I am the JD admissions counselor here at Vermont Law Graduate School. I see a few familiar faces here. It's nice to see you. Hi, Colin. Good to see you. Thank you all for joining. It's nice to see you. It's a beautiful day outside here. I hope all of you have had a wonderful week so far. The energy on campus, we were just talking about it earlier. The energy has been so great as our first and second year students gear up for the last day of classes and our 3Ls get ready for commencement. So it's a very nice energy on campus here. The sun is out. So it's getting a little warmer. I'm originally from South Carolina, so I was talking to a friend earlier today, and I was talking about how beautiful it was and how warm it was. And she reminded me that in South Carolina right now, it's like 80s, high 70s, and sunny. And so we're not quite there yet, but we'll get there. Um, we hope to share some of this happy, positive energy with you tonight as we talk about the Center for Justice Reform that we have here on campus. So to help us do that, we have Jessica Brown here with us. Jessica is the director of the Center for Justice Reform here on campus, among other things. Jessica is also a member of our faculty and has been with us since 2021 after a 24-year stint as a public defender in both New Hampshire and Vermont, in both the state and federal criminal legal systems. So Jessica has been involved in several state and county level initiatives to develop restorative justice programs and treatment models and to address racial disparities in the criminal and juvenile legal systems. So tonight, Jessica will share with us some information about our Center for Justice Reform here on campus, and then I will open it up for some questions. So with that, I will hand it over to Jessica.
Thanks so much, Jordan. Hi, everyone. We're really glad you could join us tonight and grateful and thankful to have you with us tonight. As Jordan said, my name is Jessica Brown. I'm an assistant professor of law here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Prior to joining the faculty in 2021, I was a public defender for 24 years, so the last 10 years or so here in Vermont, and prior to that, I was in New Hampshire. In June of 2022, I became the Associate Director of the Center for Justice Reform, and as of July 1st, 2023, I became the Director. The courses that I teach as a professor include criminal law to first-year law students, so any of you who join us here in the fall might have me as your criminal law professor next spring. I teach constitutional criminal procedure in the fall. So that's an upper level course for second and third year students. This semester I had the joy and privilege, really, it was a wonderful class of teaching a restorative justice class called Race, Crimes, and Restorative Justice. And as the director of the Center for Justice Reform, one of my jobs is to oversee our 2-degree programs that we offer, a Master of Arts in Restorative Justice and a Professional Certificate in Restorative Justice. And so I'm really going to talk to you broadly about how restorative justice shows up in both our academics here at our curriculum here at VLGS, but also just in our community and our culture here at VLGS. During the transition from the prior director of the Center for Justice Reform to my becoming the center director, one of the things that our team did was draft a mission statement, and I'm going to share it with you. The Center for Justice Reform at Vermont Law and Graduate School exists to transform the ways that communities engage with each other, respond to harm, and pursue justice. We advance this mission by empowering VLGS students to think restoratively while equipping them with knowledge and skills to be agents of change. The CEJR was founded on the pillars of restorative justice and justice reform under the stewardship of our founding director, Professor Bobby Sand, and the director who preceded me, Professor Stephanie Clark, who was instrumental in developing our degree programs, our restorative justice degree programs. So I'm talking about restorative justice, and I want to give you a couple of definitions that I really like. But before I do that, I was hoping that you all would help me out a little bit. I'm curious to know what you think about justice. And so I'm going to give you two different prompts. The first prompt, and I would ask you to drop one word into the chat. What's the first word or the main word that comes to your mind when you hear the phrase criminal justice system? Criminal justice system. What word comes to mind? Drop it in the chat. Whatever comes to mind first. Punitive, broken, racist. More thoughts? All right. Needs improvement. Now, what comes to mind? Targeted, bias, fixed. Okay. Now, what comes to mind when you simply hear the word justice? What's the first, what word connection do you make when you simply hear the word justice? Equity. Any other oxymoron? Corrected. I think that often it's interesting that we refer to the criminal justice system when we think about the word justice on its own. We often don't think of justice in its purest form on its own as necessarily what we get from the system that we have in this country to try to address harms. So thank you to those of you who dropped words in the chat. I appreciate it. Appreciate your contributions. So now I'm going to give you a couple of definitions of restorative justice. The first is the definition that is used by Howard Zehr, who is considered a leading restorative justice facilitator and practitioner in the US. I would say a more modern day. I will talk momentarily about the origins of restorative justice, but Howard Zehr wrote a book called The Little Book on Restorative Justice, which is often a primer for people just learning about restorative justice. And his definition is as follows. Restorative justice is a process to involve, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in a specific offense and to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. And then another definition that I heard at a conference that I went to about restorative justice once that was shared by someone who works in a restorative justice organization out in the Pacific Northwest that I really liked is as follows. Restorative justice is a practice through which we analyze the ways we show up and occupy spaces. Restorative justice is a practice through which we reflect on how we react to conflict. Restorative justice is a practice through which we actively oppose systems of oppression. Restorative justice is an internal and cultural shift away from punitive measures to instead focus on healing harms when they occur. This shift is rooted in the values of building and maintaining relationships. Restorative justice without equity is neither restorative nor is it just. And finally, restorative justice values are not new. Restorative justice has been practiced by Indigenous communities globally since time immemorial. So I really like that sort of updated, more modernized definition because I like that it talks about how we show up and occupy spaces because as a lawyer myself and as someone who worked in the criminal legal system, I tend to think about restorative justice as an alternative way to respond specifically to harms that occur that we would otherwise criminalize. But restorative justice isn't just a response to criminal conduct. It is really, to me, about how we show up and occupy spaces, how we engage with other people. And it's really about, as this author put it, building and maintaining relationships and repairing them when they need to be repaired. But you all are future JD students and future lawyers. And so I really want to talk to you about, yes, our Master of Arts in Restorative Justice, and also other ways that we try to incorporate restorative justice principles and practices and values in our community at Vermont Law and Graduate School. So first, the details. JD students at VLGS can get joint, so let me actually specify, residential JD students at VLGS can get joint degrees. And I'm here to talk to you specifically about the Master of Arts in Restorative Justice. If you are a residential JD student, you can jointly pursue a Master of Arts in Restorative Justice. Typically, joint degree students will take several, I'm going to start calling it MARJ, M-A-R-J, Master of Arts in Restorative Justice, several MARJ courses during the summer after completing your first year of law school. MARJ classes are offered both online and residentially. Just to give you an example, this summer, our residential classes include restorative justice theory and practice, restorative justice in Indigenous communities, Truth and Reconciliation, which is a survey of countries like Rwanda, South Africa, where there have been genocides and there have had to be, decades later have been truth and reconciliation processes. And our last residential course this summer is scheduled to be peacemaking courts. The summer terms are intensive terms. Only one class is taught at a time, generally over 1 or 2 weeks. So a student who who takes every class offering over the summer, every residential class offering, could earn somewhere around 14 credits toward the Master of Arts in Restorative Justice. So most students who are pursuing a joint degree do try to earn a lot of credits that first summer, which leaves them, their second summer maybe to take a job, or an internship for the summer. So to complete the MARJ, you have to earn a total of 30 credits. 9 of those credits can be shared with your JD credits. So really, if you think about it, to be a joint degree student and to earn a Master of Arts in Restorative Justice, you would have to get 21 additional credits on top of 9 that you could share with your JD credits. You can only share credits once you've declared that you're pursuing the MARJ. So for example, if you declare before you start your first year of law school, or you declare before the spring semester of law school starts, you could opt to apply your criminal law credits toward both your JD and your MARJ degrees. I do specifically want to shout out those of you who are considering doing our online hybrid JD program and tell you that although online hybrid JD students cannot pursue joint degrees, one of the elective tracks available to our online hybrid JD students is a restorative justice track. So I work closely with Professor Roger Powell, who is the director of our OHJD program, to select and schedule online restorative justice classes that will be available to our OHJD students. And I'll add that, we are still in the early years of our OHJD program. We currently have two online cohorts, but we are definitely exploring options with those students that are interested with coming for one of the summer intensives and being here residentially for 2 weeks to take a residential restorative justice class in the summer. So there is some flexibility to change it up and give you as many opportunities as we can. So a typical Master of Arts in Restorative Justice course load will include a foundational class like Origins, Evolution, and Critical Issues in Restorative Justice, Principles of Restorative Justice, or RJ Theory and Practice. And then there are restorative justice classes that are specific to a topic like restorative justice in educational institutions. I mentioned restorative justice in Indigenous communities. We offer a class called New Approaches to Domestic and Sexual Violence. We have a class to build trauma-informed interviewing and advocacy skills. It's called Adversity, Trauma, and Victimization. I mentioned a class that I've been teaching this semester, Race, Crimes, and Restorative Justice. We have a class called Youth Justice Reimagined. We have a class called Clemency, Pardon, and Expungement, and a class we're offering next spring called Ethics and Restorative Justice. And there are a few others that I haven't listed. We try to make our classes available on a rotating schedule so that a student, whether you're a residential student or an online student, you will at some point have an opportunity to register for as many different classes as possible. The Master of Arts in Restorative Justice program includes a practice and facilitation requirement. In the JD program, we refer to it as experiential learning. In the MARG academic regulations, we refer to it as the practice and facilitation requirement, but it's essentially an experiential learning requirement. And we have a few different ways that students can satisfy that requirement. And those include through some of our classes. So we have a class called Restorative Justice Facilitation. We have a couple of levels of motivational interviewing classes. We have a class called Teaching Restorative Justice. So there's a certain list of classes that will, the credits for which will be can satisfy the practice and facilitation requirement. We also master's students can also do externships to satisfy their practice and facilitation requirement. And finally, we also have a clinic as part of the Center for Justice Reform. The history of our clinic is that it started as an immigration defense clinic here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. It is now under the umbrella of the Center for Justice Reform, and we call it the Center for Justice Reform Clinic. And we are slowly growing that clinic to provide post-conviction criminal defense services in addition to continuing to provide immigration defense. Some examples of the work that the clinic faculty and student clinicians have done include a couple of different types of pop-up clinics. They've gone to college campuses to do Know Your Rights clinics for students who are not U.S. citizens. They've assisted college students in preparing and submitting applications for asylum. They regularly do sort of open house opportunities where non-citizen Vermonters can come meet with student clinicians at our Burlington office and have questions answered and receive information about eligibility for immigration benefits, representation in their defense against deportation, and other humanitarian relief. We have done several expungement clinics on campus. Student clinicians meet with clients who have signed up for appointments to discuss seeking to expunge criminal records, which is a process that can really have the impact of drastically improving access to employment, housing, public benefits, and other opportunities that are often precluded when someone has a criminal record. We have had several opportunities for students to work with incarcerated clients preparing for parole hearings. Specifically, we've done some work helping survivors of human trafficking get criminal convictions expunged so that they can get off parole. The clinic faculty and the student clinicians have also done advocacy with legislators to co-sponsor various immigration-related legislation and acts and policies. We've had summer fellows that we have co-supervised with an organization called Migrant Justice to do farm-based outreach to educate undocumented farm workers about pathways to immigration benefits and status. And the clinic faculty also do some advising for criminal defense attorneys around the state who are representing lawful permanent residents as well as undocumented citizens on how to resolve criminal cases in ways that minimize adverse collateral immigration consequences. One of the clinic's biggest successes was to win asylum for a family who had entered removal proceedings in 2017. The family had survived decades of gender-based violence in their country of origin. And a student clinician who got to work on the case said this after the final hearing, quote, "I can't explain how I feel right now, but I feel immense gratitude. Seeing the way our clients' kids embraced her when she told them the news is a moment I'll never forget. Thank you for asking me to be a part of today." So to be clear, our clinic is really part of the law school. So most of the students in it are JD students, just like you're going to be. Um, our clinic has opened up to have graduate students. So some of our student clinicians are earning their Master of Arts in Restorative Justice, and some of the JD students who are in our clinic are joint degree students. So they are earning their JD and their Master of Arts in Restorative Justice. I want to talk a little bit about how a Master of Arts in Restorative Justice can advance your job prospects. Even if you are not specifically considering Vermont Law and Graduate School because of our restorative justice offerings, once you are here in our JD program, I always encourage students to take a restorative justice class, because more and more, I think that restorative justice practices are going to be embraced in so much of the work that lawyers do, whether you practice criminal law, environmental law, business law, animal law, energy law. Any legal work that you might do in the future can be enhanced by a restorative justice lens. As a school at which students can earn a Master of Arts in Restorative Justice, we try to incorporate restorative justice concepts and practices into as much of the culture here as possible, whether that's a student group or a faculty meeting, or addressing a topic of importance in the community or in the classroom. So I'll talk a little bit about, I'll give you an example of how I try to incorporate, introduce the students in my criminal law class to restorative justice concepts. Like I mentioned, criminal law is a first-year doctrinal law class. So every first year student has to take criminal law. Here at VLGS, we offer it in the spring semester. So it's in the second semester for most students. And one of the early in the semester, when students are learning how to read and understand criminal statutes and different types of criminal laws, one of the types of statutes we learn about are called strict liability offenses. Strict liability just means it doesn't matter if you intended to do the act or if it was inadvertent. For example, a really basic example might be selling liquor to an underage person. If there's a statute in your jurisdiction that makes that illegal, the statute probably doesn't say knowingly provide alcohol to a minor. It probably just says it's unlawful to provide alcohol to someone under the age of 21 years old. So even if you did it not knowing, not realizing that the person was actually under age 21, you could still be liable. So as part of the lesson on strict liability, I invite two of my former colleagues, both of whom were public defenders when I was a public defender, one of whom is now a prosecutor, the other one's still a public defender. And when Sally became a prosecutor, and while Will is still a public defender, they had a case together. Will represented a person who Sally had charged with animal cruelty. Will's client was a person who struggled with housing instability and also had mental illness. And he had a companion pet dog. And long story short, his companion pet was taken into custody by the police and taken to a veterinarian, an emergency vet, who determined that the dog's health was not salvageable, and the dog had to be euthanized. And Will's client, like I said, was charged with animal cruelty. This all happened in February 2020, right before the pandemic started. Now, part of the reason I use this case as an example for the class at this particular period of time in the semester is because in Vermont, the animal cruelty statute under which Will's client was charged is a strict liability offense. So it didn't matter whether Will's client intended to, intentionally neglected or didn't, provide proper care for his pet. It only mattered that the pet was neglected and wasn't receiving proper care. So it's an example of a strict liability offense. But the other reason that I have my students hear the story of this case is because Will and Sally eventually ended up using a restorative process to resolve the case. So rather than, although initially Will's client was charged in court, the case was diverted out of court and referred to the Burlington Community Justice Center, and Will's client was offered a restorative process. And that process involved eventually having a circle dialogue in which Will and his client participated, Sally participated, the veterinarian from the emergency vet participated, someone from the Burlington Community Justice Center facilitated, and I think someone else from maybe an animal rescue organization participated. I don't think any of the police officers participated, but that wouldn't, they might have been invited to. That wouldn't be uncommon, or it might be appropriate in some circumstances for the officer to be involved, because from Will's client's perspective, the decision to euthanize his dog had been made without him even knowing it was happening. So he was very upset. But the community members, the veterinarian and the police, obviously felt that Will's client had criminally neglected the dog. So having a restorative process was a way to address the harm that had been caused. And it's sort of an unusual situation because here really the harmed party was the animal. And so there's no way to really have the animal represented in the process. But having the veterinarian and the other animal rescue advocate involved was a way for them to sort of educate Will's client about, the responsibilities of pet ownership and kind of what he would need to be able to do and to provide if he were to have a pet in the future. For Will's client, it offered him the opportunity to sort of share the impact on him, or to talk about sort of his own circumstances and the relationship he had with his pet. And obviously, it also helped him to avoid going through traditional criminal prosecution and potentially ending up with a conviction on his record. So that's a way that I introduce, there's a criminal law lesson in the story, and there's also a restorative introduction to restorative justice for my students in hearing about this case. And it's particularly, I think, effective at VLGS, where many students come because they are particularly interested in animals and animal law. So it's a way that I try to bring restorative justice into what would otherwise be kind of a straightforward doctrinal criminal law class. So I started to talk a little bit about how a Master of Arts in Restorative Justice can advance job prospects. And I just want to kind of go back to that for a little bit. I have advised Marge students who have I advised one Marge student who was working on a paper that was about using restorative justice in cases when a survivor of human trafficking is being charged with crimes. that only arose because the person was being trafficked, and that student then went on to work as a consultant for the National Survivor Network to transform how criminal legal systems around the US respond to harm caused by people who have also experienced harm, right? Public defender offices and prosecutors' offices are increasingly hiring attorneys and non-attorneys specifically to identify cases that come into their offices that should be offered the option of going through a restorative justice process and to coordinate and facilitate those processes. Criminal legal systems more broadly are providing off-ramps to alternatives to traditional prosecution that incorporate restorative justice processes. In Vermont, for example, every county has a community justice center and a restorative justice center that accepts cases from the county court system that are being recommended for a restorative justice response. Schools at all levels, K through 12, and colleges and universities are also increasingly hiring restorative justice facilitators to develop and implement restorative justice processes to respond to conflict and harm in schools. I can think of a few of our graduates who have earned restorative justice degrees or joint degrees who are working in higher education, colleges and universities in like the code of conduct department to bring that RJ perspective to that work. I regularly hear from students applying for jobs that may not specifically list restorative justice background as a criteria for the job, but the students are telling me that prospective employers are really excited to hear that a student is bringing a restorative justice background because, as I said earlier, I think increasingly, especially in the legal profession, whatever kind of law you may be practicing, your work can be enhanced by bringing experience and knowledge about restorative justice. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Jordan because I've been hearing myself speak now for quite a while. And I will ask Jordan to let me know what questions are in the chat that I can try to answer.
Absolutely. I love hearing you speak. So thank you so much. And I would again invite anyone who has any additional questions to either throw them in the chat, or if you're comfortable sharing via you're welcome to unmute yourself and show your camera if you'd like. So we can give it a few minutes. It looks like you covered most of the questions that have popped up in the chat. It looks like LaQuisha had questions about the master's program. And then I'll keep scanning through.
I see a question about doing the master's program virtually. So the answer is basically yes. If you're a residential JD student and you want to do a joint master's degree, I believe that theoretically you could do it all through online classes. There aren't the same, there are regulations by the American Bar Association with regard to online JD programs versus residential JD programs. So like if you're a residential JD student, there's a limit on the number of credits that you can earn towards your JD that are online, but the master's degree is not governed by the American Bar Association. So in theory, yes, you could do, even if you're a residential JD student, you could do your Marge entirely online if you were getting a joint degree. Again, I want to be clear that if you're an online hybrid JD student, you cannot do a joint degree, but you can choose the restorative justice pathway elective and take quite a few restorative justice classes during your time as an online hybrid JD student.
Awesome. Okay. Does anybody have any other questions? I had one question prepared, but you answered it fairly quickly. So it was just about professions and how does the Marge kind of set you apart, or restorative. I guess that is kind of a question that I do have. So for the students that are in the online hybrid program, if they do choose a restorative justice concentration, do they still have that competitiveness I guess with the knowledge that somebody that has a MARJ or a master's in restorative justice has in the professional field.
I think so. I mean, and Jordan, you may have to help me out because I forget how many. So a traditional residential JD student finishes the program in 6 semesters. And I think is the online hybrid JD 10 semesters? Is that right?
It is 10 consecutive semesters.
Okay, 10 consecutive semesters. So I probably should know this, and for the next time I'll make sure I find out. I'm not sure how many restorative justice classes an online hybrid JD student will end up taking over those 10 semesters. And you don't get to, as an online hybrid JD student, you don't start taking your elective classes right away. You start with the traditional first year classes, and they are spread out over a little bit more time. But for example, I know that our original cohort who started in 2022, our original online hybrid JD cohort who started in 2022, they've now taken principles of restorative justice. I know they're going to be taking, I want to say, restorative justice in education this summer. So, I certainly think that by the end of the online hybrid JD, RJ Pathway students will have taken at least as many restorative justice classes as students who are not JD students who are pursuing what we call our professional certificate in restorative justice, but I imagine even more. And I would, even though it's technically not like a separate or additional degree, like I would absolutely put on my resume, like as part of my education and my degrees, that I had like a concentration in restorative justice. And for employers who know what restorative justice is and care about that, I think that's going to look really good.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, we have a question in the chat here asking if you could speak a little bit more about the certificate in restorative justice.
Sure. So that is a 9-credit degree. It's I would say most people, like I'm going to say like 99% of the people who do it take it entirely online, although there's nothing to stop someone from taking one or more of the classes residentially. But essentially, you could you complete a professional certificate in restorative justice with 3 classes, because most of our RJ classes are 3 credits each. And so a PCRJ is essentially a 3-class program. Those are not, so technically those are not graduate credits. However, our current program is such that you could start as a PCRJ student, and if you decided that you wanted to pursue a Master of Arts in Restorative Justice, you could transition to the MARJ program, and those credits that you've earned as the part of the PCRJ program would be would be attributed towards your master's degree. Hopefully that makes sense.
Awesome. And we have a question from LaQuisha in the chat, curious as to, I might be able to answer this one. I'm curious, as most people taking online hybrid is mostly due to economics and still want the opportunity to pursue a legal degree. And I think, why can't, so LaQuisha, you're asking why can't an online hybrid student pursue a joint degree? Is that correct?
Or is that in response to the question about lived experience credits?
We'll answer both. So I'll answer the
sorry,
first.
it's about the MARJ. I'm sorry.
Sure, like the joint degree.
Yes, because I won't be coming to Vermont except for the few short credits that are available if I'm accepted. But that is definitely due to economics. And I know most people who will be going, it'll be due to the same thing. A lot of people cannot take time off and go to school, but still want to pursue their education and move forward. And so I'm definitely one of those people. And so it seems like it would be great to also provide the master's as something that people can pursue if they should choose to, especially the online hybrid people, especially if there's disproportionate impacts in that category. So I was more curious as to, well, why is that? And just trying to get more clarification on that one.
Sure. Let me give my thoughts, and then Jordan, if you want to add anything else. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, LaQuisha, and thank you for jumping on. It sounds like you are going to be starting our online hybrid JD program, and the question is, why can't OHJD students pursue a joint degree, like officially, as opposed to the concentrations or pathways that our program currently offers. So I'm definitely not an expert on the online hybrid JD program, and I'm going to throw my contact info in the chat at the end of our conversation, but I'm sure that Jordan or someone else from the admissions office can also provide you with contact information for Professor Powell, who's the director of the online hybrid JD program, who might be able to better answer this question more specifically. But here's what I'll say for right now. Our online hybrid JD program is pretty new, and there aren't a lot of online hybrid JD programs around the country. We're not the first, but there aren't a lot yet, although it's definitely an expanding area. And one of the reasons, though, that there aren't a lot yet is because they haven't been allowed until very recently. And that has to do entirely with the American Bar Association. The American Bar Association accredits law schools and establishes the rules about, established the rules about residential JD programs and is establishing the rules about online hybrid JD programs. And they're pretty strict. And to your point, most people who are doing an online hybrid JD program are doing it because they either can't move to a location with a law school, or because they're full-time working professionals, and they are doing this education in addition, which is why online hybrid JD programs are longer than residential JD programs, right? Because I think for most of them, I want to say that our students take one or two, maybe, I think like 2 classes a semester, as opposed to like 4 or 5 in the first year. So I think that I don't think that I'm going to put it on the ABA for the moment, because I think it would be extremely difficult to be pursuing a JD as an online student and at the same time pursuing a master's degree. So for example, let me just be even more sort of specific about it. As I mentioned, for most of our residential JD students who decide to pursue a master's degree, and the Master of Arts in Restorative Justice is not the only master's degree that we offer at VLGS. Students can do joint degrees in a number of different environmental master's degrees, energy, animal law, etc. So most students who decide to pursue a joint degree do their whole first year of law school, and then that first summer after their first year of law school earn a bunch of master's degree credits. And I don't know, and that would be impossible for an online student, because online students are taking law school classes year round, right? There's not that summer break. It's, as Jordan put it, 10 consecutive semesters of law classes. So I think that what we've tried to do is offer a way to, or provide a way to allow online hybrid JD students to have access to our specialized classes as electives, whether that's restorative justice or environmental law or energy or animal law, or I think there's going to be a general practice pathway starting soon, and I forget what the other one. Food and agriculture. So we came up with these concentrations to allow our online students to have access to some of these specialized elective classes, but it would be really difficult, and I just don't think that the ABA would allow it, for online hybrid JD students to be pursuing a master's degree jointly at the same time. So I hope that may not be a satisfying answer, but I hope it makes sense.
Awesome. So we do have some more questions popping up in the chat. So Peter asks, is there any relationship between the restorative justice system and the alternative dispute resolution system?
So by alternative dispute resolution, I like the word that pops into my head is mediation. And I wouldn't say that, a lot of people, I think it's easy to equate or think that restorative justice and mediation are the same. And certainly there are some similar concepts, but they're also different. I think the way I think about restorative justice, particularly as in contrast to the traditional criminal legal system, is that the traditional criminal legal system, sort of where we start from, is asking like what laws were broken and who did it and what do they deserve, right? Restorative justice asks who was harmed, what is the harmed person's needs, and who has obligations to try to meet those needs. Mediation, the way I think about it anyway, and I'm not a mediation specialist by any means, but mediation to me seems to be more about, can we find some compromise that everybody can agree on to resolve whatever the dispute is? And that's different to me than focusing on a harmed party, identifying what their needs are, and then talking about like, okay, so who has obligations to try to meet those needs? And the other thing that I really love about restorative justice is that I've been talking about the harmed party a lot, but really restorative justice can involve anyone who was impacted by a conflict or by a harm. And I think, particularly as an alternative to the traditional criminal legal system and prosecution, that restorative justice also asks us to think about what the needs are of the person who's responsible for causing the harm and how that person's needs may not have been met, which may be why that person caused the harm that they did. You know, I was talking about my former colleague's client who got charged with animal cruelty. And obviously, like I mentioned, that he was unhoused, that he had mental illness, and these were all needs of his that were not being met. And we can, you know, sometimes the hard question to answer is who has obligations to try to meet that person's needs. And I have opinions about that, but I feel like restorative justice asks us not just to think about the sort of directly harmed party, but to think about everybody involved in a situation and what their needs are and who has obligations to try to meet those needs. Because I would posit that if we are meeting the needs even of the responsible party, right, then it is much more likely that that person won't be in a situation where they're causing harm again in the future.
And Amy in the chat has said, I've taken racial equity trainings by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, which provide a great foundation on how people have been disproportionately affected by the system. Do we expect to dive into those foundations for restorative justice courses?
Absolutely. I'm not familiar with the program or organization that you specifically mentioned here, but having just finished teaching a class called Race, Crimes, and Restorative Justice, I can tell you in great detail, except that we only have 11 minutes left, but I can tell you in great detail what we talked about and read. But I would be happy to tell you. So we read. So the way I approached the class was to start with sort of a historical overview of racial disparities in the criminal legal system in the US, starting from slavery. So we read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. We also watched things like Ava DuVernay's film 13th. There are some podcast episodes. Well, the podcast stuff that I included really was more when we got into the restorative justice materials in class. But so we transitioned from like a historical background on that really helps illustrate how mass incarceration is tied back to slavery in this country. So that's where we started. Some of the materials that we read when we transitioned to really talking about restorative justice as a response to harm that would otherwise be criminalized as a way to try to address racial disparities in our criminal legal system, including mass incarceration, et cetera. We read not Howard Zer's book, but Fania Davis is Angela Davis's sister, and she wrote the little book on race and restorative justice. So we read that, and we read a book by a woman named Danielle Sered called Until We Reckon, which talks about her organization that she founded in Brooklyn that provides restorative justice services in response to violent crimes in New York City. So yes, I would say that you, in probably more than one class, would have the opportunity to dive into the topic of the disproportionate impact on marginalized communities in the criminal legal system.
And Tremaine has asked a two-parter question. First part, does restorative justice act as a diversionary option for the court? And then the second part, I could repeat it if you need me to. Also, are there any offenses that do not qualify for restorative resolution?
So I can talk specifically about how restorative justice works in Vermont, but I do think that restorative justice is a growing sort of movement, I guess I'll call it, as an alternative to traditional criminal prosecution. You know, it's growing around the country, but in Vermont, so yes, in Vermont, our court system is set up by county. And every county also has what's either called a community justice center or a restorative justice center. And one of the services that those centers provide is that cases can be diverted out of court to the community or restorative justice center for a diversion program, which would typically include some sort of restorative process. Let's see. Are there any offenses that do not qualify for a restorative solution? So presently in Vermont, in fact, there are certain offenses that by statute are not eligible for diversion programs. Domestic violence offenses, sexual violence offenses. There is one pilot program in one of our counties right now that in which it's a pilot program to divert certain types of domestic cases to this diversion program. And that if there is legislation pending, I actually am sort of behind, so I don't know what the status is of the legislation, but to change those statutes that have prohibited certain offenses from being eligible for diversion to allow some more types of offenses to be eligible for diversion and restorative practices. But I'll also just add really quickly that even if, for example, technically a certain offense is not eligible for diversion, or just it's a serious offense, it's a serious crime, and the prosecution is not offering an alternative to traditional prosecution, that doesn't mean that a restorative practice can't be incorporated into still the traditional criminal legal system. We looked at a lot of cases in the class that I taught this semester in which, you know, someone committed a violent crime, was prosecuted, found guilty, went to prison for a long period of time, but the impacted parties, the harmed parties, the victims, over time came to a place where they realized that the healing and the closure that they wanted would actually come from being able to have a dialogue with the person who harmed them. And so even with people still in prison, there can be a victim offender dialogue, there can be a circle dialogue with impacted parties and the responsible party. So there are definitely restorative justice advocates and facilitators and practitioners who would say that the only true restorative justice process has to be entirely separated from the criminal legal system. With that said, I appreciate that restorative justice processes can and are sometimes incorporated into cases that are still prosecuted in the criminal legal system when the parties, particularly the harmed parties, recognize that that would be a process that would be beneficial and helpful to them.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Peter asks in the chat, what if the harm in question is done not to a physical person or animal, but to an institution like the state? Can the restorative justice still be effective here?
I think so. I mean, like DWI is this is a very basic example, and I'm kind of thinking through it as I talk out loud, but DWI is a classic example of a crime where in the best case scenario, like no one is injured, there's not an accident, there's not any physical harm to any person or property or anything like that, but it's still a crime and people still get arrested and charged for it. So it literally is a crime against the state, right? Because there's no sort of traditional person we would identify as the victim. I think I'm not necessarily saying that our state would offer diversion or restorative processes entirely as an alternative to being prosecuted for a DWI, but you are making me think that like some sort of restorative process, like typically now in Vermont, if someone is convicted of a DUI, part of the resolution of their case and being able to get their license back eventually is typically going to involve some sort of program where they learn about the impact of DUI. And so maybe in that sense, we already are kind of doing a little bit of restorative work, but there can be situations where maybe the victim, maybe the harmed party doesn't want to participate in a restorative process with the responsible party, or maybe there isn't a quote unquote victim. And sometimes what we refer to as a surrogate can stand in because the process can still be good for the responsible party. It's still a way to educate the responsible party about the impact of their conduct. So not every restorative process involves everybody that it potentially could. And there are restorative practices, that can still be done with a responsible party, even if there's not a victim involved, or even if the victim doesn't want to be involved, and vice versa. There can still be ways to do restorative work with a harmed party, even if the responsible party is not in a place where they want to engage.
We have one more minute and one more question. So Tremaine has asked, the restorative process does well in addressing the harm done to the victims. What are your thoughts as to the reconciliation of the harm caused to the community as a result of the crime to which grand jury is asked with determining?
So I got a little confused with the end of the question, bringing the grand jury in. My thoughts as to reconciliation of the harm caused to the community by the crime. I'm not trying to, okay. Caused to the community by the crime. So the larger community. I'm not this is not going to be the best answer, but this is what you made me think of. So the last public defender, the office that I worked in is the one in Burlington. It's for the county that Burlington's in. And Burlington's the biggest city in Vermont. And there's an area in Burlington called Church Street, which is really charming area with a lot of shops and restaurants, and it attracts a lot of tourists. And like most states in the country, we also have, we have homelessness. We have a lot of Vermonters with substance use disorder. And so all these things come together, and the business owners get really frustrated with people stealing from them, with people with substance use disorder being out on Church Street, and they fear like scaring away tourists, et cetera, et cetera. And I think about that relationship or that dynamic all the time, and how, rather than thinking of more ways that we can criminalize the conduct to essentially try to incarcerate and hide the people that are undesirable to the businesses, I think a lot about how that's a big community restorative process that I would love to see happen, where we were engaging in dialogue to achieve like understanding of people's circumstances and why we have the levels of homelessness that we have in our state and in Burlington in particular, and how we could be better addressing other problems like substance use disorders, and that if we were better addressing those needs, then we would also be better serving the community at large, like the businesses and the business owners, because the problems that they see out on the street in front of their businesses would be diminished. So I don't feel like that's the best answer to your question, but that's what came to mind. And I see that Ellen put all my info in the chat, so thank you for doing that. I'm happy to, I'm not always super speedy at responding to emails, but I'm happy to engage and try to answer more questions if people have them about VLGS, the JD program, the Marge. Yeah, so please reach out.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, Jessica, and thank you all for joining us as well. Ellen has also put my contact information as well as my calendar link. So if you prefer a phone call, of course, feel free to always just call in when you have time. If you prefer to schedule, there's a scheduling link as well. Thank you all so much. It was a pleasure. Jessica, it was a pleasure.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you all so much.
Take care.